Our remaining videos that cover invertebrate phyla are essentially going to be a list of organisms and their very broad characteristics. For each of these groups, just like we did with protists and plants, you're going to need to know the broad defining characteristics of these groups. And then you'll also want to know an example. Now, I would suggest learning an example that is going to remind you of these groups so that you have something in your head to kind of give you a general characteristic. For all of these, I will give you one. If there's a specific organism, like a specific example that we talk about, you probably want to know that one. If there's a disease that we talk about or a really important type of organism, you probably need to know that one. The rest of this chapter is a lot of memorization, just kind of getting down those general characteristics. It'll probably help you remember if you work on the phylogeny, kind of make a informed pathway through their characteristics and their relationships. If we start there at our phylogeny, we've already gone through our Ctenophora, Porifera, and Cnidaria. And we are going to move into our groups of Bilateria, or the bilateral organisms. Of our bilateral organisms, there are three major clades, or major groups of these bilateral organisms. We have two groups that are protostomes and one group that are deuterostomes. If you need a review on bilateral or radial symmetry and protostome or deuterostome, you'll want to go back to the video part 1 of chapter 26 lecture or review your notes. The protostomes are broken down into two groups called the Lophotrochozoa and the Ecdysozoa. I would really encourage you to learn those names. Try to pronounce those names. If you look at them really carefully, they sound like they're spelled. So really make sure that you have that word in your brain because you may not be able to recall it later if you can't remember how to say it. Excuse me. So these organisms are called the Eumetazoa. These are organisms that have true tissue. Our Eumetazoa are more complex organisms. So because they're animals, they are multicellular, and they are also going to have true tissues and generally a more complex body plan. So Eumetazoa technically contains also the Porifera and the Cnidaria. We're going to focus on the even more complex organisms in the Eumetazoa that have more organized tissue, more complex development, etc. The group that we're going to focus on are called the Lophotrochozoa. And this is kind of an odd word. I know it's kind of hard to say. A lophophore is a horseshoe-shaped ring of tentacles whose job is to bring in food. Just like the jellyfish cnidocytes, they bring in food into the center. The trochophore part of the word is an organism that has a larval stage with a band of cilia. It's not super important to me that you know what these are. I'm just kind of trying to explain this really weird word that you probably never heard before. Basically, what it's saying is that the ancestral organism had this horseshoe ring of tentacles, and the larval stage of the ancestral organism had a band of cilia around the center. The lophophore and the trochophore may not be present in all of these organisms, but we will see some of those characteristics in some of them if we look at the organism or look at the development. We may not actually see examples of these in our class examples, but again, this is just to show you that there's a reason for this really weird word, and there's a reason that you need to know it. And basically, that's that all of these organisms fall into this category with this common ancestor. Of the Lophotrochozoa, we are going to cover a few of these groups. We're not going to talk about all of them. We're going to do examples of just a couple of them. We're going to start with the Platyhelminthes, which are flatworms. These flatworms don't have a coelom. They are considered acoelomate. If you need a refresher on coelom or acoelomate, you'll want to go back to your notes from the first video. Flatworms are mostly predators. Because they're animals, they're heterotrophs, but specifically they eat other organisms. They have bilateral symmetry. You can see through this flatworm down the center. He is very much bilateral. And then they have a head with concentrated sensory organisms. This organism that we have here, this is a planaria. We looked at these in our animal lab. They're really fun to watch. I really enjoy them. But the cool thing about these guys is that you can cut them into sections, and each of the sections will regenerate the head and the tail end. So these guys are super important in understanding cell division and cell cycle control. There's a lot of research being done with planaria and cancer, so kind of the link between that cell cycle control in these organisms and how their cells can essentially indefinitely divide to regenerate the missing parts. Because in cancer cells are cells that continuously divide due to a lack of cell cycle control. But these planaria control their cell cycle very tightly and still have these cells that they can allow to grow essentially uncontrolled, or at least in a relatively controlled, infinite manner to regenerate these organisms. But we've got the head with the sensory organs in the front, not what we would consider a brain or a super complex nervous system, but they do have those sensory organs up at the front. So our platyhelminthes, our flatworms, are all going to have kind of the same general body plan. They are all triploblastic, which means they have endoderm, ectoderm, and now the development of a mesoderm. This is going to lead to much more complex movement, and we start to see more sophisticated organs. So with these guys, we get tissues and organs that we weren't seeing in previous animals. So they don't have a coelom, a true coelom. Many of them are going to be acoelomate. Some of them are coelomates, just depends on how their development proceeds. These guys don't have specialized respiratory or circulatory systems, and this is related to why they are flat. There's a couple things about their characteristics that make them flat. One is that without that respiratory or circulatory system, their nutrients, gas, etc., have to happen by diffusion. So they're not cycled through the body, they have to diffuse through the body, which means they have to be very close to the animal's surface and very close to one another. So they don't get very thick. This is going to lead to a thin body shape. It also produces a highly branched digestive system. Now, what this means is that all of those branches of the digestive system are going to allow the nutrients and whatnot to get to different areas of the body. So if we have digestive system that extends through other regions, we don't have to have a circulatory system that's going to move those nutrients around. So all of that branching is going to get those nutrients to more places. A couple of examples. We have tapeworms that are generally a nuisance. They cause digestive issues and things like that. You may have heard about different types of tapeworms that make people sick. So this is an example here. And then also in our Lophotrochozoa, besides the platyhelminthes, we also have rotifers. This is a separate group from the platyhelminthes. And then we have the bryozoa. This structure here, this is our lophophore. So the bryozoa have these lophophores still. You can see that it's sort of this horseshoe ring of these tentacles that come out of the organism. So there's your example for the lophophore. Our next group in the Lophotrochozoa are the mollusks. You know these guys as snails, slugs, clams, oysters, octopi, and squid. Many of you are probably familiar with some cool examples of these guys. They're a very diverse group. They have a lot of roles. Many of them are very ecologically important. Some of them are economically important, good or bad. And some of them are just really cool looking. Many of them are a problem because they can be a intermediate host for parasites that get passed on to other organisms. One of the negative things is that they in some cases are destructive to wood. So this would be a problem for property and things like docks and whatnot in the water. Some of these are invasive. Many of these are aquatic. Some of these are exclusively aquatic, like our octopi and our squids, but you'll recognize some of these as definitely being terrestrial as well. Our slugs and snails are terrestrial. As I mentioned, you'll want to remember at least one example that's going to help you maintain what is happening in this group here in the mollusk group. I would say go ahead and recognize snails as an example because although octopus and squid are very interesting, their characteristics are a little harder to see as far as the general structures of these guys. So key features of a mollusk, they are going to have a soft body. So if you think about a snail or a slug, they're very soft bodied, and many of them have a shell. So our snails have a shell, clams, oysters, they all have shells. They might have different structure cells, but they do have shells, they do have shells that work to protect that really soft body. That body has three main parts. One is the muscular foot. That's going to be important for movement. And then they also have what we call a visceral mass. This is basically the structure that encloses all of the organs. So above the foot, we have all these organs here. We've got the stomach, we've got the heart and some circulatory system. And then surrounding that, we have this structure called a mantle. So mantle is going to be up on top of that visceral mass. And this is where we may get the shell. So the mantle in the organisms that have a shell, the mantle is going to secrete the shell. And then that shell will rest on top of the mantle. They eat by a little structure called a radula. This is basically equivalent to a tongue, but it's kind of rough on the bottom. It basically is kind of a scraping type organism. It's got these little hook-like structures that allow them to scrape algae and things off of their substrate that they live on. A couple of quick examples. We've got bivalves, so our clams and oysters, scallops, mussels are going to be our shells that open in two. You probably recognize that many of these are food. So they are important in food economy. There are many groups of people that eat these quite regularly. Obviously, if you are from an area where there's a lot of ocean surrounding islands, things like that, these are going to be more important as a food source. And then we've got the gastropods. So the gastropods are the largest class. These are going to include our snails, um, and then sea slugs and things like that. So these are the ones that have the foot that is going to help them move around in their environment. So we've got a snail here, a tree snail. We've got a sea slug on the bottom. I think it would be a great idea to look up periwinkles and limpets just so you can get an idea of what they look like. And again, I would kind of think of a snail as your sort of normal mollusk. But in our lab, we'll see a couple of different shells and things like that that come from these organisms. All right, interesting group within the mollusks. We've got the cephalopods. So this is going to include our octopus, squid, nautili or nautiluses, and cuttlefish. If you are unsure what any of these are, I would say go ahead and Google them. There's some really cool looking cephalopods. They are very morphologically complex. They do some cool things. We are not even going to scratch the surface on our cephalopods. But one of their distinguishing characteristics from the rest of the mollusks is a closed circulatory system. And then they also have blood with hemocyanin. So hemocyanin is going to make their blood look blue. Cyanin means blue, so this is a blue colored hemoglobin. It makes me very happy to look up different kinds of octopi. They're just really cool, intelligent organisms. They also have a beak in the center that has a radula type structure in it. In the head region, that's basically their visceral mass where they've got all their organs and whatnot. And then they've got their tentacles that are going to help with their movement. So they don't really possess that foot like the others, but they can absolutely move around with their tentacles. Right. Our next group in the Lophotrochozoa are the annelids, or the segmented worms. We talked about segmentation in our first video. Segmentation is basically distinct regions or chambers in the organism. Those segments may be identical and repeating, or they may be differentiated. It just depends on the organism. The segments are separated by a septum. A septum is usually a sort of a flexible partition. So for example, you have a septum in your nose made out of cartilage. The chambers of your hearts are separated by septums. The annelids, again, there's a wide variety of these. They are coelomates. They have a circulatory system and coelom fluid that's going to move nutrients and waste. The coelom fluid is sort of a structural element as well in our annelids. It provides basically a pressure back against the organism from the inside to give them their 3D structure. They have a complete digestive system. A complete digestive system means that it runs from the mouth to the anus. So there's a hole for the mouth, a hole for the anus, and your food passes all the way through it. The digestive system is unsegmented, which means it's the same all the way through. A couple of quick examples here for you to look at. I would use your earthworm as sort of your standard example of the annelids. We talked about earthworms when we were talking about coelomates. Leeches are another great example of the annelids.